The courtroom felt as though it had stopped breathing altogether. It was an eerie stillness, a thick silence that seemed to stretch on without end. The only sound that could be heard was the quiet ticking of an old wall clock, each second dragging the tension out just a little longer. A faint rustle of legal papers could be heard as they shifted, the slight sound betraying the otherwise heavy air. Sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, casting soft rays that touched the dust particles drifting lazily through the room, their slow descent making them seem almost like suspended thoughts, frozen in midair. It was a quiet kind of chaos, the stillness a precursor to something that was bound to break. Every eye in the room was fixed on the small figure seated behind the witness stand, and her presence felt like a weight on everyone's chest. Her name was Mira. She was only 9 years old, yet she carried with her a gravity that even the oldest in the room could not escape. Her legs dangled above the floor, her feet far too small to reach the wooden platform beneath her, her little body swallowed by the chair that was far too large for her. In her small, delicate hands, she gripped a weathered cloth-bound storybook tightly, its cover worn and frayed from years of quiet comfort and careful handling. It was the only thing she had with her that could offer even the faintest illusion of safety. Mira wasn't wearing anything extravagant or remarkable. She wore a soft pink dress, its fabric gently hugging her small frame. Tiny embroidered stars dotted the material, as if the stars themselves were trying to offer her some sort of quiet encouragement. It was the kind of dress you'd wear when you wanted to feel brave, even when the bravery felt like it had been buried too deep inside to reach. But this wasn't a school recital. It wasn't a play or a holiday celebration. This was family court, in a small, quiet town in Oregon. And Mira was the youngest person in that room, the only child amidst a sea of adults, attorneys, clerks, a judge, and 2 parents sitting on opposite sides of the room, their hearts weighed down by blame, fear, and broken trust. Her mother sat with her lawyer, clutching a tissue in her hand, her face worn but fierce. Her eyes betrayed the sadness, the exhaustion, yet there was a fire in them still, a defiance that refused to let the flames of hope die out. Her father sat across the room, rigid in his chair, his arms stiff and clenched by his sides. His stare was hollow, yet trembling, as if his mind was a storm, and the calmness on his face was the only thing holding it all together. The tension in the room was palpable, buzzing beneath the thick silence like an electric hum, an undercurrent of energy that threatened to explode at any moment. But Mira wasn't looking at either of them. Her eyes were focused somewhere else, beyond the wooden partition, past the aisle, where a large German shepherd named Axel sat patiently, wearing a deep green vest with white words embroidered on it. Service dog. Do not pet. Axel sat motionless, but there was something in the way he held himself, an alertness that seemed to suggest he was waiting for something no one else in the room could see or understand. His presence, calm yet watchful, was like a quiet sentinel, waiting for a signal, a sign that would shift everything in the room and in Mira's world, forever. What would happen next would change everything. Mira hadn't spoken a single word in over 18 months. The silence had not arrived suddenly in a loud, jarring way. No, it had crept in slowly, a gradual erosion of sound that stole away the smallest whispers of her voice. At first, it had been little things, the soft humming, the gentle laughter, the requests for bedtime stories. Over time, those had faded away, like chalk marks disappearing under the weight of a heavy rainstorm. It wasn't that she didn't have anything to say, because that wasn't the case. It was that saying anything had once led to something terrifying, something that no child should ever have to endure. No one in that courtroom knew the whole story. Not the attorneys, not the bailiff, not even the judge. But Mira's mother knew, and, deep down, despite his blank expression, her father knew too. It had happened one cold winter night. Her father had been pacing through the house, a storm of anger bubbling beneath his skin. One wrong word, one wrong glance, and everything had exploded. Mira had tried to run, tried to hide, but it was no use. He had caught her, shaken her so violently that her world had gone dark. The bruises had faded in time, but something much more fragile had been shattered. Her voice, her sense of safety, her belief that the world could be trusted. It had all disappeared in that one moment, like sand slipping through her fingers. In the days that followed, Mira didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she folded in on herself, retreating deep. Inside, as though disappearing was the only way she could keep herself safe, her spirit didn't just dim. It fractured. She stopped reaching for hugs. She stopped asking for stories. It was as if a small, bright part of her had simply vanished, and no one knew how to bring it back. Therapists tried everything. Months of therapy sessions, trying to draw her out, drawing circles with crayons, playing with dolls, even making her color in bright pictures of happy things. But no one could reach her. Medications, nothing worked. Mira kept her lips sealed and her eyes down. It wasn't defiance, it was fear. Pure, learned fear. Then came Axel, not as a fix, but Asa, lifeline. The first time they met, Mira sat cross-legged on the floor of the therapist's office, barely blinking. Axel lay quietly across the room, observing her with those deep, intelligent eyes. He didn't move. He didn't beg for attention. But something passed between them in that silence. Axel seemed to know without instruction or training that this little girl was the one he needed to protect, the one who needed to bear reminded. She still mattered. He was introduced cautiously as part of a trauma recovery program. At first, Mira didn't even touch him, but Axel waited quiet, patient, gentle. He never barked, never rushed. He simply laid nearby, breathing steadily, matching her pace. It took weeks for her to place a hand on his back, months before she made her first sign, and slowly Mira began to communicate, not with people but through Axel. A soft touch, a specific movement, a nod, followed by a signal they had practiced in therapy. He wasn't just a comfort animal. According to her psychologist, Axel had become something far more powerful, a bridge to the world she no longer believed in. And now that bridge stood tall and silent just feet away from where Mira sat, waiting for her to cross. Judge Penelope Ward was not someone people expected to bend. She had served on the bench for over 25 years through civil disputes, custody battles, and more broken families than she cared to remember. Her reputation was crisp, clinical. She followed the law to the letter. She did not entertain emotion, theatrics, or sentiment. To many, she was respected too. Some feared but never underestimated. On this morning, she sat tall in her chair, a pair of silver reading glasses perched low on her nose. Her robe perfectly pressed, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, the kind of judge who made even seasoned lawyers sit up straighter. But something about today was different. She looked at Mira, really looked. There was no courtroom protocol in that gaze, no calculated legal assessment, just quiet observation. The way the girl clutched her book, festiveness in her shoulders, the fact that her feet didn't touch the ground. And then, the smallest shift, the flicker of Mira's eyes toward the back of the room, toward the dog. Judge Ward glanced at the German shepherd, seated calmly behind the wooden barrier. She had approved the motion to allow the service dog after reading the psychologist's testimony, but she hadn't expected to see this: a girl, held together by silence, a dog holding space for her to be more than that. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mira, she said, her voice softer than anyone in the courtroom had ever heard it. I need Tosk. Use something. You don't have to answer with words if you're not ready. You can nod or shake your head or look at Axel. Will understand. Mira didn't respond, not right away. The silence stretched long enough to feel heavy. Noon dared to speak. Not the attorneys, not the clerk, even the court reporter had paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard as if afraid a keystroke might shatter the moment. Mira remained perfectly still except for her hands. Her left hand stayed curled around the frayed spine of her story book, but slowly, carefully, her right hand began to raise, not high, just enough for those watching closely to notice. She drew a small, deliberate circle in the air, with her pinky finger barely visible, soft like a whisper. Only one being in the room would recognize. Axel did. The German shepherd's ears lifted, and he stood in a single fluid motion, not rushed, not uncertain. His movements were precise, practiced. He walked, no strode, through the small gate beside the witness stand. The bailiff moved slightly, instinctively, but the judge raised a hand to stop him. Everyone watched. As Axel approached, Mira turned and sat, other side facing the courtroom, as if taking a post. He was calm, silent, steady. Mira then tapped her chest once, twice. Axel barked, one single bark, short, but clear, and that was it. A ripple passed through the room like Akel. People looked around, confused but moved. The attorneys turned to one, another, whispering. The court clerk blinked rapidly. Mira's mother covered her mouth with both hands. Judge Ward Sad upright, her hands folded, her expression unreadable, but her eyes searched the girl's face as though decoding a message written in invisible ink. "What does that mean?" she asked without looking away, her voice low but direct, and from the back of the courtroom someone stood. It was Mira's psychologist. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. "That's a communication sequence we developed," she said. "Mira and Axel practiced it for months. It's how she tells the truth when she's too afraid to speak out loud." The judge didn't speak. Right away, she blinked once slowly. Her gaze shifted from the psychologist to Mira, then to Axel, still seated like a soldier on duty. The room held its breath. The psychologist stepped forward carefully, holding something in her hand. A small cream-colored envelope slightly bent at the edges. "She gave me this yesterday," she said gently, her voice carrying through the silence. "She told me only give this to the judge if Axel barks." Judge Ward reached for the envelope, her fingers steady, but her eyes uncertain. She opened it slowly, peeling back the flap as though it contained something sacred, and in a way it did. Inside was a drawing done in crayon, but precise in its pain. It showed a small girl, unmistakably Mira, crouched in the corner of a room. Her arms wrapped tightly over her head. Looming over her was a man, tall, red-faced, twisted in anger, his hands clenched into fists, his mouth opened in a silent roar. In the corner of the picture stood Axel, positioned between the man and the girl, his body low, defensive, his mouth open, mid-bark, his eyes sharp and watchful. The courtroom was still, but something invisible shifted. Judge Ward stared at the drawing longer than anyone expected. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her throat moved as she swallowed hard, fighting the sting behind her eyes. She'd ruled on hundreds of cases, but none had ever looked her in the face like this, through a child's truth drawn in broken lines and bold crayon. She turned the drawing over. On the back, written in Univan block letters with a blue marker, were 9 simple words. "He says he cares, but I only feel safe when he's not there." A gasp swept through the gallery. The father stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. "This is absurd. That dog's trained. She could have sit down." "Judge Ward," snapped, her voice no longer soft. It cracked through the silence like a lightning strike. "Or I will have you removed." The father froze. Axel didn't move. Mira didn't flinch for a moment. Noon moved. Judge Ward placed the drawing on the bench with deliberate care, as though afraid even a breeze might tear at. Her fingers lingered on the paper, tracing the edges like it was something living, something fragile. Her eyes flicked to Mira, then back to the words written in uneven letters. "He says Hekares, but I only feel safe when he's not there." It wasn't evidence in the traditional sense, but it was more than that. It was a child's raw truth, unfiltered by adult logic or legal argument. And in that courtroom, with all its formality and rules, that truth hit harder than anything written in a report. The father remained standing, face flushed with anger, chest heaving. "She's manipulating you," he barked, pointing at Mira. "She's using that dog. This whole thing is coached." Judge Ward didn't even blink. "This court," she said coldly, "does not take well to intimidation. You may sit, or you may be escorted out." His mouth opened as if to argue, but the bailiff took a single step forward. The father sat. Silence returned. Axel remained perfectly still, his gaze locked forward, but his buddy leaning ever so slightly into Mira's leg, a silent reassurance. "I'm here." And Mira, she hadn't moved, not even flinched through her father's outburst, but there was something different now. Her shoulders, once hunched inward, seemed to shift just slightly, like a weight had been lifted. And then, with the softest voice the room had ever heard, Mira spoke. "Axel knows who keeps me safe," she said. "Here, members, everything, even when I couldn't." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The weight of them settled into every corner of the room. Even the court reporter had stopped typing for a long moment. The room remained suspended, caught between breath and disbelief. The sound of Mira's voice, soft as it was, struck like thunder. Not because it was loud, but because it existed. After 18 months of silence, the courtroom had been witnessed to amicable quiet, but seismic. Judge Ward didn't hide her reaction. She blinked several times, as if making sure she had truly heard the words. She leaned forward, both elbows resting on the bench, fingers clasped together. Her sternness had not vanished, but something else had appeared beneath it. "Reverence." "Mira," she said gently, "thank you." Those 2 words hung in the air like a blessing. Axel still sat at Mira's side, unmoving, but his ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and he leaned a little closer, brushing her arm with the side of his body. It was Small gesture. But it grounded her. Mira's eyes didn't stray to her father. Not once. She didn't flinch when she heard his breath catch, or when his hand skirled into fists against the table. Her gaze remained forward, her focus unwavering. She had said what she needed to say. Judge Ward turned her attention to Mira's mother, whose tears now fell freely. Her lawyer rested a reassuring hand on her back. But the woman hardly noticed. Her entire being was fixed on her daughter, with awe, with sorrow, with pride, and with heartbreak, because in her daughter's voice she could hear the weight of every sleepless night, every bruise left unseen, every scream that had gone silent. It was the sound of pain that no mother ever wants to hear spoken, not in volume, but in truth. "Ma'am," Judge Ward said, voice steady, "I am granting you full custody of your child." The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, just a quiet collective release, like the building had been holding its breath with everyone else. And finally, I exhaled. The father opened his mouth again, but this time the bailiff stepped forward and shook his head. Nothing needed to be said. The judge's gabbler remained untouched. It wasn't over. Not yet. The paperwork was done. The testimony had been heard, though only a few words were spoken. The evidence lay in crayon on the judge's bench, and yet what lingered most wasn't what had been shown or said. It was what had been felt. Judge Ward gathered her files with practiced precision, stacking them neatly before her. The room had settled, though no one quite returned to normal. Something unspoken had passed through the space, something sacred, and no one wanted to break it. Her hand hovered above the gavel, poised to bring the session to a close, but she paused. Her eyes moved from the mother quietly weeping in gratitude to the father sitting rigid and defeated, then to Mira still seated on the witness stand, Axel steady by her side, the book in her lap now resting slightly open. The judge looked directly at the child, and for a rare moment in her long career, her voice wavered. "You've said more with a single signal than most adults say in 1,000 words," she whispered. She wasn't speaking as a judge then, but as a human being, one who had just seen something that pierced through every layer of legal training, protocol, and restraint. Judge Ward lowered her hand, and instead of bringing the gavel down with force, she set it on the bench, softly, not in judgment but in awe. Then without another word she stood and left. The bench and the room stayed silent, because there was nothing more to say. 6 months later, in a different kind of silence, this one filled with peace, Thiessen was warm on the park bench that afternoon. Leaves fluttered lazily in the breeze, casting moving shadows on the notebook that lay open across Mira's lap. Her small fingers held a colored pencil, carefully sketching a scene, trees, birds, and a dog that looked very familiar. Axel lay curled beside her, his eyes half closed but his ears alert as ever. He didn't need to watch her constantly anymore. She wasn't broken now, just healing slowly, steadily. Mira still didn't speak much, but she didn't need to. She laughed. She made eye contact. She had begun to sleep through the night. Her therapist said it was progress. Her mother said it was a miracle. A little boy wandered over from the playground, his hands sticky with ice cream. He stopped a few feet away and pointed at Axel. "Can I pet your dog?" Hest. Mira looked up, the corners of her lips lifting. She didn't answer right away. For a split second, her fingers twitched with hesitation, a trace of the girl who once disappeared inside. Silence, but then she set her pencil down, closed her notebook, and gently tapped her chest. Axel gave a single friendly bark and wagged his tail. The boy laughed, and then so did Mira, a real laugh, the kind that caught in her chest and spilled out like sunshine. Not just sound, but life, the kind of laugh that told the world she was still here, that the bridge was working, that healing had begun.